Summary of I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. It is 1976, 1 year after a terrible plague killed almost all people around the world. People who die around the world come back to life as vampires. They are sensitive to light, garlic, and mirrors, sleep during the day, and can't be hurt by guns. A man named Robert Neville has been able to stay alive in Los Angeles by turning his house into a fortress. Every day, he walks around the city and stabs sleeping vampires with wooden stakes. At night, he locks himself in his house to protect himself from the vampires, who only come out at night. All night, Neville hears his neighbor and old friend Ben Cortman, who is now a vampire, screaming, "Come out, Neville." Neville comes close to being hurt by the vampires more than once. One night, his watch stops, so he has to drive home after dark and fight Ben Cortman and the other vampires. Neville just makes it back to his house without dying. After that, he drinks a lot and gets down on himself. In flashbacks, we see that the deaths of Neville's wife, Virginia, and daughter, Kathy, have left him very sad. In 1975, which was the year of the plague, there were many accounts of dust storms and bugs and insects with changed genes that spread the disease all over the world. After his daughter died, Neville followed the law that said all people who died from the plague had to be burned in a big pit. Neville couldn't bear to burn Virginia's body when she died, so he dragged it to a graveyard and buried it there. To Neville's shock, Virginia came back to life and walked into the house. After that, it seems likely that Neville had to kill his vampire wife a second time. Neville tries to learn about vampires to help him deal with his sadness and loneliness. During the day, he goes to where sleeping vampires hide and takes them back to his house. There, he waits for them to wake up and then holds crosses in front of their faces. Some of the vampires are turned off by the sight of a cross, but not all of them. Neville also finds out that, contrary to myth, you don't have to pierce a vampire's heart to kill it. You can pierce them anywhere. Neville also tries to kill vampires by giving them garlic, which has a chemical called allyl sulfide that smells bad. But the allyl sulfide doesn't make any of the vampires he tests react in any way. Neville is able to find the vampire germ by learning about medicine, taking vampires' blood while they sleep, and looking at the blood under a microscope. Neville finally figures out that there are two kinds of vampires, those who are still alive and the true undead. The first type of vampire is a human who has the vampire plague but still has some control over their thoughts. The second type is a dead person who has come back to life and is now wild and dangerous. Neville finds out one day that there is a real dog living outside his house. The dog seems to have the vampire germ, but it can still go outside and walk around in the sun. Neville is looking for any kind of company he can get, so he gives the dog hamburger meat and tries to get the dog to move in with him. The dog seems to be afraid of Neville, though. Over time, the vampire germ makes the dog sicker and sicker until one day it kills it. Neville fights off the urge to drink a lot after the dog dies. Instead, he gets very involved in his studies. He thinks that some vampires are afraid of crosses because they remind them of the Christian lives they used to live. But vampires who were Jewish or pagan in life might not be scared at all of the cross. The story then jumps ahead 2 years. It is now 1978, and Neville is getting used to his new life. He spends his days looking around the neighborhood for Ben Cortman's dead body. In fact, looking for Cortman is Neville's favorite thing to do. Neville is surprised when he sees a woman running through the streets one day. At first, the woman doesn't want to talk to Neville, but in the end, she decides to go back to his house. Neville finds out at home that the woman's name is Ruth and that she lived with her husband until he died the week before. Neville has a lot of doubts about Ruth. He thinks she might have the vampire germ because she doesn't like the smell of garlic. Neville tells Ruth some of the things he's learned in the past 2 years while he's with her. He knows that vampires can't be hurt by bullets because the vampire germ makes a powerful body glue that can soak up bullets. He also tells Ruth that he is resistant to the vampire germ, most likely because a vampire bat bit him while he was fighting in Panama. Neville tells Ruth that he kills vampires while they sleep. Ruth asks Neville how he can be so calm about killing them. Neville starts to feel bad, even though he didn't do anything wrong. It seems likely that he and Ruth sleep together that night. Neville insists on checking Ruth's blood. When he does, he can see right away that she has a lot of the vampire germ in her. But as he looks at the microscope, Ruth hits him and kicks him out of the house. When Neville wakes up, he finds a note from Ruth telling him that she is part of a new society of live vampires. These are vampires who haven't been killed by the germ yet, but they take special pills to keep the germ from killing them. Neville killed Ruth's vampire husband while he was sleeping. Ruth says that she was sent to watch Neville by her fellow vampires, but that she fell in love with him and didn't want to hurt him. Neville sees people from Ruth's new society killing dead vampires late at night as they walk outside. Neville hates the new society vampires because they treat murder like it's nothing. When he sees the new society's vampires killing his old enemy Ben Courtman, he has a strange feeling of pity for Courtman. Then, vampires from the new group broke into his house. Neville fights back with a gun because he's afraid he's going to die, but the vampires beat him. Neville wakes up in a prison cell next to Ruth. Ruth tells Neville that the vampires in the new society are going to kill him because, in their eyes, he is a horrible monster who has been killing them without mercy for 3 years. She gives Neville some poison pills to ease the pain of his death. Neville takes the pills and walks out of his cell toward the new society vampires who are about to kill him. As the poison kills him, Neville sees the truth. For the last 3 years, he has been afraid of vampires and thought of them as horrible monsters. But he is the monster to them. Neville has spent his whole life trying to kill live vampires. From their point of view, he is a threat, a monster, and a legend.
About the author. Richard Matheson grew up in Brooklyn. He went to college and majored in journalism at the University of Missouri. He started writing science fiction stories in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and some of them were published in science fiction magazines. Matheson kept writing a lot throughout the 1950s, and many of his stories and books were turned into movies and TV shows. The Incredible Shrinking Man is one of the most famous sci-fi movies from the 1950s. It was based on Matheson's book The Shrinking Man, which came out in 1956. Matheson also wrote more than a dozen episodes of the great 1950s TV show The Twilight Zone, including the famous Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, in which William Shatner sees a monster on the wing of his plane. Matheson was a prolific and well-known science fiction writer for the rest of the 20th century. His short story Duel was the base for an early Steven Spielberg movie with the same name, and at least 5 movies have been made from his 1954 book I Am Legend. Matheson died in Los Angeles in 2013, just a few days before he was to get the Saturn Award, which is one of the most important awards in the science fiction world.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.